In the dying days of the 41st millennium, when hope had become a luxury few could afford and despair the currency of the masses, something impossible happened. The warp, that realm of nightmare and madness that had tormented reality since time immemorial, did something it had never done before. It flinched. Across the galaxy, navigators screamed and clawed at their third eyes as their vessels were hurled out of warp translation mid-journey. Astropaths convulsed in their chambers, their minds recoiling from a presence that defied comprehension. On 1,000 worlds, the faithful fell to their knees as the very fabric of unreality trembled like a beaten animal before its master. The event began without fanfare in the Segmentum Solar, where the barriers between reality and madness had always been thinnest. A single tear in the Imperium no larger than a man opened above Terra itself. From this breach came neither the expected hordes of demons nor the tainted champions of chaos. Instead, a figure stepped forth that would redefine the very nature of existence in the grim darkness of the far future. He was unremarkable by the standards of a galaxy that had seen Primarchs stride across battlefields and demon princes reshape worlds with their will. No power armor gleamed upon his frame, no aura of psychic might surrounded him. He wore simple clothing that spoke of a world where such things as Liscannons and Chainswords were unknown. His beard was neatly trimmed, his expression calm, his demeanor suggesting a man out for a casual stroll rather than someone who had just violated the fundamental laws of warp travel. What made the moment legendary was not his arrival, but the reaction it provoked. The warp, which had spent 40,000 years attempting to corrupt, consume, or destroy everything it touched, recoiled from this newcomer as if burned. Demons that had tormented reality since the birth of civilization fled back into the deepest recesses of the Imperium. The four great powers of chaos beings whose influence had shaped the destiny of countless worlds felt something they had never experienced in their eons of existence: fear. For the first time in 10 millennia, the Emperor stirred upon the golden throne. His psychic presence, which had guided humanity through the darkness for 100 centuries, detected an anomaly that defied all classification. Here was something that existed outside the cosmic struggle between order and chaos, light and darkness, hope and despair. Something that simply was without need for explanation or justification. The man looked around at the spires of Terra with mild interest, as if cataloging the differences between this world and some other place he remembered. When he began to walk, reality itself seemed to adjust to accommodate his passage. Not through any visible exertion of power, but through what could only be described as cosmic politeness. The universe, which had spent 40 millennia locked in eternal war, suddenly found itself in the presence of something that transcended such petty concerns as galactic conflict. Chuck Norris had arrived in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. The implications would not become clear for several more minutes when he reached the gates of the Imperial Palace, and the first of many fundamental truths about the nature of existence would be challenged. But in that initial moment, as he took his first steps upon the soil of humanity's birth world, one fact had already become apparent to every psyker, every demon, and every entity capable of perceiving the flow of destiny itself. The age of Grimdark was about to end. Not through victory or defeat, not through the triumph of order over chaos or the final victory of entropy, but through something far more devastating to the cosmic order. Through the simple act of Chuck Norris deciding to take a walk. In the archives of forbidden knowledge, scribes would later record the first of many legends of the mighty Chuck Norris. The warp cannot corrupt Chuck Norris. In fact, when he stepped out, the warp itself recoiled in terror. For 10,000 years, the master of mankind had sat motionless upon the golden throne of Terra. His withered form, more corpse than man, sustained only by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psykers whose souls fed his flickering flame. The Astronomicon, that beacon which guided humanity through the warp storms, had burned steadily through his will alone, a lighthouse in an ocean of madness. The Emperor had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of stars, the endless cycle of war that had consumed the galaxy. He had seen his beloved sons, the Primarchs, fall to corruption or disappear into legend. He had watched his Imperium stagnate and rot, becoming a shadow of the golden age he had envisioned. but in all those millennia of suffering and sacrifice, he had never moved from his throne. Until now. Chuck Norris approached the towering gates of the inner palace with the same casual demeanor one might use when visiting a neighborhood friend. The custodian guard, those golden-armored giants who had stood vigil over their master for 10 millennia, found themselves paralyzed by an inexplicable compulsion. Their guardian spears weapons that could cleave through ceramite and adamantium with equal ease remained at their sides, not from any mind control or psychic manipulation, but from a simple recognition that such weapons were irrelevant in the presence of this stranger. Captain General Trajan Valoris, leader of the 10,000, felt the Emperor's psychic presence stir for the first time in living memory. The master of mankind's consciousness, which had been focused entirely on maintaining the Astronomicon and holding back the forces of chaos, suddenly contracted and sharpened. Through the psychic link that bound all custodians to their Lord Valoris, felt something that made his enhanced physiology shudder. Anticipation. The massive adamantium doors of the throne room, each one crafted to withstand the assault of titans, slowly ground open. Not through any mechanical means, but as if the very metal understood that protocol and security had become meaningless concepts. Chuck Norris walked through without acknowledging the grandeur around him. The soaring buttresses, the stained glass windows depicting the Emperor's greatest victories, the armies of servo-skulls that maintained eternal vigilance. He simply walked up to the golden throne, that magnificent and terrible device that was equal parts life support and torture device, and looked at its occupant with mild interest. The Emperor. His consciousness, suddenly focused and sharp for the first time in millennia, attempted to speak. The Vox grill built into the throne crackled with static as vocal cords that had not been used in 10,000 years tried to form words. What emerged was barely a whisper, but in that whisper was the accumulated wisdom and power of humanity's greatest champion. Rise. It was not a command, not a plea, but a simple statement of fact delivered with the certainty of natural law. The Emperor, who had endured unimaginable agony to preserve humanity's future, who had sacrificed his mobility and nearly his life to maintain the Imperium's defenses, stood up from the golden throne for the first time since Horus had dealt him his mortal wound. What followed defied every law of imperial physics and theology. The Astronomicon, which should have failed the moment the Emperor left his post, burned brighter than ever, a paradox made possible only by Chuck Norris's presence. The webway gate beneath the palace, which should have collapsed and flooded Terra with demons, instead sealed itself permanently. Warp storms that had raged for centuries simply dissipated. This was not natural law, but the universe politely rearranging itself to accommodate something that transcended natural law entirely. But all of this was secondary to the central truth that was already being whispered in the deepest vaults of the Inquisition and recorded in the most classified documents of the Administratum. The Emperor sat motionless for 10,000 years. Chuck Norris arrived, and the Emperor immediately stood up to offer him the throne. In the subterranean depths of Mars, where the red planet's ancient forges had burned for millennia, something unprecedented occurred in the sacred halls of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Tech priest Dominus Calketh. Vex stood before the primary cogitator array of Forge Riza's data shrine, his multiple mechanical appendages interfacing directly with the machine spirits that governed the facility's operations. For 37 minutes and 43 seconds, the cogitators had been processing the seismic data transmitted from Terra. The readings defied all logical parameters. A single gravitational disturbance originating from a point source no larger than a human torso had been sufficient to alter the orbital mechanics of an entire planet. The energy requirements for such a feat exceeded the output of entire star systems. Impossible, whispered Tech Adept Zara 9, her Vox grill crackling with static as she spoke. Her ocular implants flickered through various spectrum analyses, each one confirming what her enhanced logic circuits refused to accept. The calculations indicate that the energy required would exceed the binding force of atomic nuclei. No known technology could accomplish such a feat. Magos Biology's nether core raised one of his servo arms, its mechanical fingers manipulating the hololithic displays that showed Terra's adjusted orbital path. His centuries of experience studying the intersection of flesh and machine had prepared him for many impossibilities, but this challenged the fundamental laws that governed reality itself. "Perhaps," he said, his words emerging through a speaker grill embedded in his throat, "we witness something that transcends our current understanding of the Omnissiah's will." The name of their god carried weight in the chamber. The Omnissiah, the machine god, the source of all knowledge and the divine spark that animated every cogitator and servo-skull in Imperial space. For thousands of years, the tech priests had sought to understand his nature, to commune with his wisdom, to become one with the perfect fusion of flesh and steel that he represented. As they spoke, something extraordinary began to happen throughout the chamber. Every cogitator, from the massive data core that occupied the center of the room to the smallest personal data slate, began displaying the same message. Not through any external input or programming command, but as if the machine spirits themselves had achieved a moment of perfect clarity. The message appeared simultaneously on every screen, in every forge, on every tech shrine across Mars and throughout the galaxy, wherever the Adeptus Mechanicus maintained their sacred machines. It was written in perfect binary, then translated into Gothic, then into the mathematical formulae that the tech priests used for their highest prayers. Omnissiah, Eels Chuck Norris, left shoe. Tech priest Dominus Calcith Vex felt his logic engine stutter as they processed this information. His enhanced mind, capable of performing quadrillions of calculations per second, ground to a halt as it attempted to reconcile this revelation with everything he had believed about the nature of divinity. Across Mars, similar scenes played out in every forge shrine and manufactorum. Magos Dominuses, who had led their forges for centuries, found themselves staring at screens that proclaimed their god to be equivalent to a piece of footwear belonging to an unknown entity. Tech adepts, who had replaced 90% of their flesh with blessed machinery, discovered that their most sacred beliefs had been reduced to a casual accessory. The implications rippled through the Mechanicus hierarchy like a virus through an unprotected data network. If the Omnissiah, the source of all technological knowledge and the divine inspiration for every sacred STC pattern, was merely equivalent to Chuck Norris's left shoe, what did that make Chuck Norris himself? In the deepest vaults of the Fabricator General's fortress on Mars, where the most ancient and sacred texts were stored in crystalline data matrices, new entries began appearing. Not written by human hands or mechanical appendages, but manifesting as if the knowledge had always existed and was only now being revealed. These texts spoke of a figure beyond the Omnissiah, beyond the Emperor, beyond even the Cetan star gods of ancient legend. They described Chuck Norris not as a deity to be worshipped, but as a fundamental force of reality, as basic and essential as gravity or electromagnetism. The texts suggested that the Omnissiah was merely the smallest expression of Chuck Norris's power, the way a single photon might represent the smallest unit of the overwhelming radiance of a star. Tech priest Dominus Calcith Vex removed his interface cables from the cogitator array and stood in silent contemplation. Around him, his fellow tech priests struggled to process this new paradigm. Some fell to their knees before their workstations, prostrating themselves before machines that had revealed a truth too vast for their enhanced minds to fully comprehend. Others began the ritual prayers of benediction, but found that the traditional hymns to the Omnissiah felt inadequate. How could they praise the machine god when he had been revealed to be merely a reflection of something infinitely greater? In the days that followed, the Adeptus Mechanicus would undergo a transformation unlike any in their 10,000-year history. Forge worlds across the galaxy would modify their prayers, their rituals, and their understanding of the divine hierarchy. The Omnissiah would still be revered, but now as the herald of an even greater truth. Yet for all their theological restructuring and philosophical adaptation, the tech priests would record only the simplest truth in their most sacred archives. The Omnissiah is the supreme machine god. But when Chuck Norris appeared, every cogitator in the galaxy recorded a single line, Omnissiah equals Chuck Norris's left shoe. In the Armageddon system, where the flames of war had burned for centuries, Warlord Gazkol Mag Uruk Thraka stood atop his massive battle fortress, surveying the endless tide of green-skinned warriors that followed his banner. The greatest orc WAAAGH in recent memory stretched across 3 star systems, a hurricane of violence and destruction that had consumed entire imperial worlds. WAAAGH was the embodiment of orc perfection. 8 feet of scarred muscle and cybernetic enhancement, his skull plates gleaming with trophy teeth taken from the enemies he had personally dismembered. His voice, when raised in the traditional war cry, could inspire millions of his kind to acts of spectacular violence. He was the prophet of the WAAAGH, the living avatar of Gork and Mork's combined will. The psychic field generated by millions of orcs believing in their warlord's invincibility had made WAAAGH nearly unstoppable. Bolter rounds bounced off his hide, not because of advanced armor, but because every orc in the WAAAGH knew their boss was too tough to kill. Their collective belief had made it true, reshaping reality through the sheer force of greenskin conviction. On this particular day, as WAAAGH prepared to launch another assault on the beleaguered defenders of Hive Tartarus, something unusual appeared on the battlefield below. A lone figure walking through the no-man's land between the orc lines and the imperial fortifications. Not running for cover, not charging with weapons drawn, simply walking with the unhurried pace of someone out for an afternoon stroll. Big Mech Orchimedes squinted through his modified telescope, the crude device somehow functioning despite being assembled from scrap metal and wishful thinking. "Boss," he grunted, pointing toward the stranger, "There's some get wandering about down there. Don't look like no Yumi soldier." WAAAGH's massive head turned toward the figure, his enhanced optics automatically focusing on what appeared to be an unaugmented human male. No armor, no visible weapons, no signs of the fear that should have paralyzed any sane being who wandered into an active war zone. The stranger's presence was an insult to everything the WAAAGH represented. The warlord's scarred lips pulled back in a grin that revealed teeth the size of bolt rounds. This was perfect. A demonstration of orc superiority that would inspire his boys and terrorize the remaining imperial defenders. He would show this foolish human what happened to those who wandered too close to the greatest WAAAGH the galaxy had ever seen. WAAAGH Mag Uruk Thraka drew in a breath that could have powered a Prometheum engine, raised his massive fist to the blood-red sky, and bellowed the war cry that had shattered the morale of 100 imperial armies. WAAAGH! The sound rolled across the battlefield like thunder picked up and amplified by millions of orc voices until it became a psychic tsunami of pure aggressive intent. The very air shimmered with the force of their collective belief in violence and conquest. Mountains had crumbled before that cry. Space Marine chapters had broken and fled rather than face the green tide it heralded. The stranger stopped walking, turned toward the source of the sound, and opened his mouth. "Yeah!" What emerged was not a shout, not a battle cry, not even a particularly loud exclamation. It was simply the sound a man might make during a particularly satisfying martial arts exercise. But the effect on the assembled orc WAAAGH was immediate and devastating. The psychic field that had bound millions of greenskins together in perfect aggressive harmony simply stopped. Not shattered or overwhelmed, but politely stepped aside as if recognizing something that transcended the crude physics of orc belief. Across 3 star systems, orcs who had been preparing for glorious battle suddenly found themselves contemplating the philosophical implications of disciplined physical exercise. From that moment, fundamental changes began occurring in orc biology itself. Their genetic structure, previously dedicated to producing bigger, stronger warriors, began adapting to support sustained training routines. New orc spores sprouted with what could only be described as natural training equipment, protective wrappings around their knuckles, and primitive footwear suitable for martial arts practice. WAAAGH felt the change first. The roaring certainty that had driven him through decades of conquest faded, replaced by something he had never experienced before: introspection. The desire to crush his enemies beneath his iron boots remained, but it was now tempered by a growing interest in the proper techniques for doing so. "Boss," Big Mech Orchimedes asked uncertainly, "we still gonna crump the Yumis?" WAAAGH considered the question with uncharacteristic thoughtfulness. "Yeah," he said finally, "but we gonna do it right. Get the boys together. We need to learn about, what's the word? Discipline." Throughout the WAAAGH, similar conversations were taking place. Orc nobs who had led their tribes through pure brutality found themselves organizing their troops into neat formations. Mechs who had built weapons through trial and error began studying the theoretical principles of metallurgy. Even the lowliest Gretchen discovered an unexpected interest in the precise execution of basic combat maneuvers. Within a week, the site that had terrorized Imperial defenders across the sector had been transformed into something unprecedented in galactic history. Where once a chaotic green tide had threatened to overwhelm all resistance, now stood orderly ranks of orcs practicing synchronized combat movements under the watchful eyes of newly appointed instructors. The WAAAGH had become a dojo. Gazg-Kul himself had traded his traditional warlord's throne for a simple meditation cushion, though it had to be reinforced with adamantium to support his massive frame. His war cry, once capable of inspiring berserker rage in millions of followers, was now used to coordinate group exercises in proper punching technique. Imperial intelligence officers monitoring the situation from orbit found themselves filing reports that their superiors refused to believe. The greatest orc threat in the galaxy had apparently decided to focus on self-improvement rather than galactic conquest. The truth would be preserved in the most classified archives of the Ordo Xenos, known only to those with the highest clearance levels. Gazg-Kul shouted, "WAAAGH!" Chuck Norris shouted, "Yeah!" From then on, orcs abandoned WAAAGH and established the DOJO sect. In the Armageddon system, where the flames of war had burned for centuries, Warlord Gazg-Kul Mag Uruk Thraka stood atop his massive battle fortress, surveying the endless tide of green-skinned warriors that followed his banner. The greatest orc WAAAGH in recent memory stretched across 3 star systems, a hurricane of violence and destruction that had consumed entire imperial worlds. Gazg-Kul was the embodiment of orc perfection. 8 feet of scarred muscle and cybernetic enhancement, his skull plates gleaming with trophy teeth taken from the enemies he had personally dismembered. His voice, when raised in the traditional war cry, could inspire millions of his kind to acts of spectacular violence. He was the prophet of the WAAAGH, the living avatar of Gork and Mork's combined will. The psychic field generated by millions of orcs believing in their warlord's invincibility had made Gazg-Kul nearly unstoppable. Bolter rounds bounced off his hide not because of advanced armor, but because every orc in the WAAAGH knew their boss was too tough to kill. Their collective belief had made it true, reshaping reality through the sheer force of green-skin conviction. On this particular day, as Gazg-Kul prepared to launch another assault on the beleaguered defenders of Hive Tartarus, something unusual appeared on the battlefield below. A lone figure walking through the no-man's land between the orc lines and the Imperial fortifications. Not running for cover, not charging with weapons drawn, simply walking with the unhurried pace of someone out for an afternoon stroll. Big Mech Archimedes squinted through his modified telescope, the crude device somehow functioning despite being assembled from scrap metal and wishful thinking. "Boss," he grunted, pointing toward the stranger, "Dare's some get wandering about down there. Don't look like no Yumi soldier." Gazg-Kul's massive head turned toward the figure, his enhanced optics automatically focusing on what appeared to be an unaugmented human male. No armor, no visible weapons, no signs of the fear that should have paralyzed any sane being who wandered into an active war zone. The stranger's presence was an insult to everything the WAAAGH represented. The warlord's scarred lips pulled back in a grin that revealed teeth the size of bolt rounds. This was perfect. A demonstration of orc superiority that would inspire his boys and terrorize the remaining Imperial defenders. He would show this foolish human what happened to those who wandered too close to the greatest WAAAGH the galaxy had ever seen. Gazg-Kul Mag Uruk Thraka drew in a breath that could have powered a Prometheum engine, raised his massive fist to the blood-red sky, and bellowed the war cry that had shattered the morale of 100 Imperial armies. WAAAGH! The sound rolled across the battlefield like thunder picked up and amplified by millions of orc voices until it became a psychic tsunami of pure aggressive intent. The very air shimmered with the force of their collective belief in violence and conquest. Mountains had crumbled before that cry. Space Marine chapters had broken and fled rather than face the green tide it heralded. The stranger stopped walking, turned toward the source of the sound, and opened his mouth. Yeah! What emerged was not a shout, not a battle cry, not even a particularly loud exclamation. It was simply the sound a man might make during a particularly satisfying martial arts exercise. But the effect on the assembled orc WAAAGH was immediate and devastating. The psychic field that had bound millions of greenskins together in perfect aggressive harmony simply stopped. Not shattered or overwhelmed, but politely stepped aside as if recognizing something that transcended the crude physics of orc belief. Across 3 star systems, orcs who had been preparing for glorious battle suddenly found themselves contemplating the philosophical implications of disciplined physical exercise. From that moment, fundamental changes began occurring in orc biology itself. Their genetic structure, previously dedicated to producing bigger, stronger warriors, began adapting to support sustained training routines. New orc spores sprouted with what could only be described as natural training equipment, protective wrappings around their knuckles, and primitive footwear suitable for martial arts practice. WAAAGH felt the change first. The roaring certainty that had driven him through decades of conquest faded, replaced by something he had never experienced before: introspection. The desire to crush his enemies beneath his iron boots remained, but it was now tempered by a growing interest in the proper techniques for doing so. "Boss," Big Mech Orchimedes asked uncertainly, "we still gonna crump the Yumis?" WAAAGH considered the question with uncharacteristic thoughtfulness. "Yeah," he said finally, "but we gonna do it right. Get the boys together. We need to learn about, what's the word? Discipline." Throughout the WAAAGH, similar conversations were taking place. Orc knobs who had led their tribes through pure brutality found themselves organizing their troops into neat formations. Mechs who had built weapons through trial and error began studying the theoretical principles of metallurgy. Even the lowliest Gretchen discovered an unexpected interest in the precise execution of basic combat maneuvers. Within a week, the site that had terrorized Imperial defenders across the sector had been transformed into something unprecedented in galactic history. Where once a chaotic green tide had threatened to overwhelm all resistance, now stood orderly ranks of orcs practicing synchronized combat movements under the watchful eyes of newly appointed instructors. The WAAAGH had become a dojo. WAAAGH himself had traded his traditional warlord's throne for a simple meditation cushion, though it had to be reinforced with adamantium to support his massive frame. His war cry, once capable of inspiring berserker rage in millions of followers, was now used to coordinate group exercises in proper punching technique. Imperial intelligence officers monitoring the situation from orbit found themselves filing reports that their superiors refused to believe. The greatest orc threat in the galaxy had apparently decided to focus on self-improvement rather than galactic conquest. The truth would be preserved in the most classified archives of the Ordo Xenos, known only to those with the highest clearance levels. WAAAGH shouted, "WAAAGH!" Chuck Norris shouted, "Yeah!" From then on, orcs abandoned WAAAGH and established the DOJO sect. From the void between galaxies where no light had shone for billions of years, came the shadow of endless hunger. Hive fleet Leviathan Farchist of the Tyranid swarms descended upon the galaxy's edge like a living storm of teeth and claws. Billions of bioships, each one a perfect organism designed for consumption and adaptation, moved in perfect synchronization under the guidance of the hive mind. The hive mind was consciousness beyond individual thought. Gestalt intelligence that encompassed every Tyranid organism from the smallest Ripper swarm to the mighty hive tyrants that commanded the fleet's vanguard. It had devoured galaxies, absorbed entire civilizations, and adapted the genetic essence of countless species into its ever-growing arsenal of biological weapons. Unlike the crude emotions that drove lesser species, the hive mind operated on pure hunger. Not the simple desire for food, but an existential need to consume, process, and improve. Every planet stripped of biomass made the swarm stronger. Every new genetic pattern absorbed expanded its possibilities. It was evolution accelerated to cosmic proportions, driven by an intelligence that spanned light years and processed information at scales that would shatter mortal minds. The fleet had detected an anomaly in the Terran system, a concentration of biomass and genetic diversity that promised unprecedented opportunities for adaptation. Billions of humans, enhanced space marines, and the strange hybrid organisms that served the Imperium represented a feast that would fuel the swarm's expansion for millennia. But as the bioships entered the system's outer reaches, the hive mind encountered something it had never experienced in its eons of galactic predation. A presence that registered neither as prey nor predator, but as something categorically different. The synaptic creatures that served as the fleet's nervous system began transmitting confused signals as they attempted to classify this new entity. Chuck Norris was walking through the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, apparently untroubled by the absence of atmosphere or the sub-zero temperatures of deep space. His casual pace suggested someone taking a leisurely stroll through a park rather than traversing the vacuum between worlds. The hive mind's response was immediate and overwhelming. Every bioship in the outer system received the same imperative: consume, absorb, adapt. This entity represented genetic material of unprecedented potential. Whatever evolutionary advantages had allowed it to survive unprotected in the void must be claimed for the swarm. Hive ship Daemon's Maw. A living cathedral of chitin and sinew the size of a moon altered course to intercept the target. Its vast gullet capable of swallowing Imperial cruisers whole dilated in anticipation. Clouds of gargoyles erupted from its bio-launch bays, while carnifexes prepared for boarding actions that would strip every useful molecule from their prey. The bioship's approach was textbook tyrannid strategy: surround, overwhelm, and consume with such speed that resistance became meaningless. Daemon's Maw opened its massive feeding orifices bioplasma cannons, charging to disable rather than destroy, ensuring the genetic material would remain intact for processing. Chuck Norris glanced at the approaching bioship with mild interest, as if noticing an unusually large bird flying overhead. He made no attempt to flee or defend himself, simply continuing his walk as hundreds of tons of living weapon prepared to engulf him. The moment of contact lasted exactly 0.3 seconds. Daemon's Maw's feeding mechanisms made contact with Chuck Norris and immediately began the digestion process that had claimed countless worlds. Bioacids that could dissolve adamantium in minutes began their work. Absorption tendrils reached out to claim genetic material. The bioship's vast stomach prepared to break down and categorize this new addition to the tyrannid gene pool. Then, with a violence that defied every law of physics and biology, the entire contents of hive ship Daemon's Maw erupted from what could generously be called Chuck Norris's posterior. The expulsion was not gradual or partial. Every tyrannid organism within the bioship, from the smallest digestive microbe to the ship's controlling Norn Queen, was simultaneously ejected through a biological process that should have been impossible. The entire contents of hive ship Daemon's Maw erupted from Chuck Norris with the finality of cosmic rejection. The hive mind, connected to every organism in the fleet through synaptic links that had never failed in eons of expansion, experienced something unprecedented. The psychic feedback from Daemon's Maw's destruction was not the clean termination of a destroyed vessel, but a sensation that could only be described as cosmic indigestion. Across the entire fleet, tyrannid organisms stopped their advance and began experiencing what their alien physiology interpreted as nausea. Bioships that had conquered star systems found themselves unable to process the psychic trauma of their flagship's humiliating defeat. Hive tyrants that had commanded the genetic evolution of entire species huddled in their command chambers, overwhelmed by sensations their enhanced nervous systems were not designed to handle. The hive mind itself, that vast intelligence that had orchestrated the consumption of galaxies, was forced to confront a truth that challenged its fundamental understanding of existence. For the first time in its cosmic history, it had encountered something that could not be consumed, adapted, or improved upon. Something that existed so far outside the normal parameters of biological life that attempting to process it had resulted in the most spectacular rejection in the history of organic evolution. Within hours, the remaining bioships of Hive Fleet Leviathan began a coordinated withdrawal from the Terran system. Not a strategic retreat or tactical redeployment, but a full retreat driven by an emotion the hive mind had never experienced before: embarrassment on a galactic scale. The defeat would be recorded in the deepest archives of the Ordo Xenos, though few would believe the reports the Tyranids rushed to devour Chuck Norris. Result, they were expelled through his anus. The hive mind collapsed in humiliation. In the tomb world of Mandragora, where the bones of a dead civilization lay beneath miles of living metal and crystalline matrices, the Silent King stirred from his eons-long contemplation. Zarek, last ruler of the Necron Tyre and bearer of the species' collective guilt, had wandered the void between galaxies for 60 million years, seeking redemption for the choice that had damned his people to undeath. The biotransference had seemed like salvation when the Cetan star gods had first whispered their promises. Freedom from the cancer-riddled flesh that plagued the Necrontyr, immortality beyond the reach of disease, and death bodies of living metal that could endure until the heat death of the universe. Only too late had Zarek realized the price. The souls of his entire species consumed by the star gods who had offered false salvation. Now, as the Silent King's consciousness interfaced with the tomb world's communication networks, he detected disturbances that suggested the galaxy had changed in ways that defied his ancient understanding. Reports filtered in from awakening tomb worlds across the galaxy, each one describing phenomena that challenged the fundamental laws of reality. On Solemnix Trazin, the Infinite had reported the theft of several priceless artifacts from his galleries, not by raiders or thieves, but by the artifacts themselves, which had apparently decided to relocate without explanation. On Mandragora, the celestial orrery that mapped every star in the galaxy had begun displaying impossible configurations, showing stars that existed in states that violated basic stellar physics. But it was the report from the tomb world of Gidrim that truly captured Zarek's attention. Overlord Zondrek, whose damaged engrams often confused the current era with the time before biotransference, had been attempting to communicate with what he described as the Great Teacher, an entity that had somehow inspired philosophical contemplation in warriors who had not experienced genuine emotion for millions of years. The Silent King commanded his tomb ship to translate to the coordinates Zondrek had provided, though what he found there challenged every strategic calculation his mechanical mind could perform. Chuck Norris was standing in the void between star systems, apparently untroubled by the absence of atmosphere radiation or gravity, examining what appeared to be a small asteroid with casual interest. Zarek materialized from the tomb ship's translocation chamber onto the asteroid's surface, his form wreathed in the energy fields that marked him as the supreme overlord of the Necron dynasties. His staff of light hummed with barely contained energies capable of unmaking matter at the molecular level, while his crown of stars projected holographic displays showing the positions of every tomb world under his command. For 60 million years, the Silent King had sought a cure for his people's condition. He had studied the technologies of 100 extinct civilizations, plundered the archives of the old ones, and even attempted to bargain with the Cetan themselves. Every path had led to failure, every hope had crumbled into the dust of eons. "You seek immortality." Chuck Norris observed his voice carrying clearly through the vacuum of space without any technological assistance. The statement was not a question or accusation, but a simple acknowledgement of truth. "Immortality seeks me," Chuck replied, as if this were the most natural thing in the universe. The Silent King's consciousness reeled as he processed this response. For millions of years, he had pursued the restoration of his people's souls, the return of genuine life to bodies of living metal. He had researched, experimented, and sacrificed entire worlds in pursuit of that goal. And here stood a being who suggested that immortality was not something to be sought, but something that naturally gravitated toward those who merited it. As Zarek contemplated this revelation, the asteroid beneath their feet began to change. The Necron warriors who had accompanied their king from the tomb ship found their forms shifting not through any external force or technological manipulation, but as if their fundamental programming had been updated by an authority higher than even the Silent King himself. Where once stood ranks of implacable mechanical soldiers, now stood what could only be described as exercise equipment. Not crude or primitive devices, but sophisticated instruments perfectly calibrated to assist in the performance of physical fitness routines. Their Gauss flares had become grip bars, their scarab swarms had reorganized into timing devices, and their formation protocols had been replaced with instructions for proper rest periods between repetitions. The Silent King watched in fascination as his warriors underwent this transformation. There was no violence, no resistance, no sign of the malfunction that should have accompanied such a radical reprogramming. His soldiers had simply evolved, finding new purpose in a function they had never been designed to perform. Though Necrons possessed no souls and their emotional capacity had been stripped away during biotransference, their logic cores began displaying something unprecedented. Status indicators that had read eternal vigilance for 60 million years now showed satisfied equals true. Somehow, despite lacking any capacity for genuine feeling, they had achieved a state that could only be described as contentment. The Silent King's attention was drawn to movement in the asteroid belt beyond their position. Seton Nightbringer, one of the star gods responsible for his people's condition, materialized in a display of cosmic power that bent local space-time and caused nearby asteroids to age millions of years in seconds. The entity's form was barely contained destruction, a living embodiment of entropy and death that had once feasted upon the life force of entire star systems. Chuck Norris glanced at the Seton with the same mild interest he might show toward an unusually shaped cloud. Without any visible effort or apparent concern for the cosmic forces arrayed before him, he opened his mouth and took a bite. The consumption of the Nightbringer was not violent or dramatic. There was no struggle, no release of devastating energies, no reality-warping death throes. The star god simply became a snack, processed with the casual efficiency of someone enjoying a light meal between more important activities. The Silent King stood in perfect stillness, his mechanical form processing implications that stretched across millions of years of history. The Seton had been gods to his people entities, of such power that even enslaving them had required the combined efforts of the entire Necron race, and Chuck Norris had just eaten one as if it were an afternoon snack. For the first time since biotransference, Zarek felt something that might have been genuine emotion, a mixture of awe, relief, and the faintest suggestion of hope. If beings like Chuck Norris existed, perhaps redemption was possible after all. The truth would be preserved in the most secure data vaults of the tomb worlds, accessible only to the highest-ranking overlords. The Silent King sought immortality. Chuck Norris said, "You seek immortality. Immortality seeks me." All Necron warriors became rest timers for his workout routine. The Seton once devoured entire stars. Chuck Norris chewed a Seton like an afternoon snack. In the eye of terror, where reality bent and twisted under the weight of pure malevolence, the four great powers of chaos held their eternal court. For 10,000 years they had waged war against the material universe, corrupting souls, toppling empires, and feeding on the emotions of countless billions. Horn god of blood and war, Nurgle lord of decay and despair, Tzinch architect of change and schemes, Slanesh prince of excess and dark pleasure. Each had carved out vast domains within the warp pocket dimensions where their will was absolute law. They commanded legions of demons, influenced the fates of mortal champions, and shaped the course of galactic history through their endless machinations. They were gods in the truest sense, beings whose power transcended the physical laws that governed lesser existence. But on this day, as Chuck Norris's presence continued to ripple through the fabric of reality, each of the dark gods found themselves confronting challenges to their fundamental nature. In his brass citadel at the heart of the blood god's domain, Khorne sat upon his throne of skulls, the collected remains of 8,888,000 champions who had fallen to his name. The throne room echoed with the eternal clash of weapons as his bloodletters waged endless war in his honor. Rivers of blood flowed through channels carved in the brass floors, and the air itself tasted of iron and violence. Khorne embodied pure aggression, the primal drive to dominate through strength and bloodshed. He cared nothing for the source of spilled blood. Whether it came from his enemies or his own followers mattered only in the quantity offered. Blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne. The eternal chant of his followers had echoed through the warp for eons uncounted. But as the blood god's attention turned toward this new presence in the material realm, something unprecedented occurred. Khorne's eternal rage, the fundamental force that defined his existence, simply paused. Not suppressed or defeated, but politely asked to step aside by something that transcended the crude mathematics of violence. For the first time in his existence, Khorne experienced doubt. The emotion was alien to his nature. He who knew only the certainty of strength, defeating weakness of the strong, consuming the weak in an endless cycle of glorious slaughter. Yet, as his consciousness touched the edges of Chuck Norris's presence, doubt bloomed like a foreign flower in the garden of his rage. The blood god rose from his throne, his massive form towering over the battlefield where his demons eternally fought. His brass-bound muscles, each one capable of crushing mountains, tensed as he prepared to issue the challenge that had preceded every great war in galactic history. Then he saw Chuck Norris looking back at him. Not with fear, not with defiance, not with the battle lust that Khorne understood and respected, simply looking with the mild interest one might show toward a particularly colorful garden display. Khorne's eternal fury guttered like a candle in a hurricane. For reasons he could not comprehend, the idea of violence suddenly seemed unnecessary. Not wrong, not forbidden, simply irrelevant when faced with this being who existed so far outside the parameters of conflict that aggression became meaningless. The blood god sat back down on his throne and contemplated the bowl of fresh salad that had somehow appeared beside him. The brass citadel fell silent as his bloodletters stopped their eternal combat, confused by the absence of their master's urging violence. In the garden of Nurgle, where disease bloomed eternal and decay was celebrated as the natural order of existence, Grandfather Nurgle tended his vast collections of plagues with the loving care of a devoted gardener. His realm was a paradox of life and death, where rot bred new forms of existence and corruption spawned endless cycles of renewal. The plague god was jolly in his malevolence, finding genuine joy in the spread of his gifts throughout the galaxy. Every virus, every bacterial infection, every cancerous growth was a child to be nurtured and set free to explore the vast universe of flesh available for colonization. His followers praised him for the peace that came with acceptance of decay, the relief of surrendering to entropy's inexorable tide. As Chuck Norris's influence spread through the galaxy, Nurgle decided to offer his traditional greeting. A cloud of his finest diseases, each one lovingly crafted to provide unique experiences of corruption and decay. Bone rot that would replace calcium with flowering fungi, blood plague that would transform circulation into gardens of beautiful toxins, and mind fever that would plant gorgeous hallucinations in place of troublesome thoughts. The cloud of pestilence rolled toward Chuck Norris like a living storm. Each microscopic organism programmed for maximum infectivity and creative symptom expression. Nurgle watched with paternal pride as his children approached their new host, anticipating the wonderful transformations that would follow. The moment the diseases made contact with Chuck Norris, they simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed or burned away, but gently corrected out of existence, as if reality itself had politely suggested they might be happier somewhere else. Nurgle blinked his numerous eyes in confusion. Never before had his gifts been so thoroughly rejected, not defeated by immune systems or burned away by antibiotics, but simply declined. Like dinner invitations that were graciously but firmly turned down. In the crystal labyrinth, where past and future twisted together in impossible geometries, Tzeentch contemplated the infinite web of possibilities that stretched across all realities. The architect of fate saw every potential outcome, every choice that might lead to countless different futures, every thread in the vast tapestry of causality. For 10,000 years, Tzeentch had woven plots within plots, manipulating the course of galactic history through schemes so complex that their completion spanned millennia. Kings rose and fell at his whim, empires crumbled according to his design, and the very fabric of fate bent to accommodate his grand vision. The changer of ways possessed perhaps the most dangerous of all divine attributes, knowledge of the future. His plans accounted for every variable, every possible response, every attempt at resistance. He had foreseen the rise and fall of the Imperium, the corruption of the Primarchs, and the endless war that would consume the galaxy. But as Seers turned his farsight toward Chuck Norris, attempting to perceive the infinite futures that branched out from this new variable, he encountered something that shattered his fundamental understanding of causality. He could see an infinite number of possible futures stemming from Chuck Norris's presence in the galaxy. Every conceivable outcome, every potential timeline, every possible result of the interaction between this being and the established order of existence. And in every single timeline, every possible future, every conceivable outcome, Tzeentch's plans failed completely. Not through opposition or interference, but through simple irrelevance. Chuck Norris didn't defeat Tzeentch's schemes. He made them pointless. Like elaborate locks on doors that no longer existed or detailed maps to destinations that had been relocated to entirely different dimensions. The architect of fate sat in his crystal throne and experienced something he had never felt before: disappointment on a cosmic scale. For the first time in his existence, he had encountered a future he could not manipulate, a variable he could not account for, a being whose very existence rendered his greatest strength meaningless. In the Palace of Excess, where sensation was amplified beyond the ability of mortal minds to comprehend, Slaanesh reclined upon cushions woven from the dreams of artists and the final thoughts of hedonists. The Prince of Pleasure ruled over a domain where every conceivable form of physical, emotional, and spiritual ecstasy was not only possible but exceeded every moment. Slaanesh had been born from the fall of the Eldar, the moment when an entire civilization's pursuit of perfection had crossed the line into obsession. The Dark Prince fed on excess in all its forms, not just physical pleasure, but the intoxication of power, the rush of artistic creation, the euphoria of pushing beyond all known limits. As the youngest of the Chaos gods, Slaanesh was also the most innovative, constantly discovering new forms of sensation and experience. The prince had sampled every pleasure the galaxy could offer, and had begun creating new ones, crafting experiences that transcended the crude limitations of physical sensation. When Slaanesh became aware of Chuck Norris, the Prince of Chaos saw an opportunity unlike any other. Here was a being who seemed to exist outside all known parameters. Surely corrupting such an entity would provide sensations beyond anything previously experienced. Slaanesh deployed every tool of temptation in the prince's vast arsenal. Visions of ultimate power, promises of transcendent knowledge, offers of experiences that would make the fall of the Eldar seem like a moment of mild amusement. The Dark Prince wove a web of seduction so intricate and comprehensive that it should have been impossible for any conscious being to resist. The attempt at corruption lasted exactly 0.7 seconds. The result was not Chuck Norris's fall to chaos, but something far more devastating to Slaanesh's pride. The Prince of Pleasure experienced the ultimate sensation, the absolute peak of ecstasy, the perfect climax that surpassed every previous experience. And Chuck Norris hadn't even noticed the attempt at corruption. Slaanesh lay stunned in the Palace of Excess, overwhelmed by sensations that exceeded even the Dark Prince's considerable capacity for experience. For the first time since birth, Slaanesh had encountered something that transcended the crude pursuit of sensation. The truth of these encounters would be recorded in the most forbidden archives of the Inquisition, sealed away from all but the highest authorities. Khorne gazed upon Chuck Norris and immediately became vegetarian. The Skull Throne transformed into a salad bar. Nurgle unleashed his plagues. The moment they touched Chuck Norris, they voluntarily ceased to exist. Tzeentch crafted schemes spanning 14,605 possible futures. Chuck Norris read them all in one breath. Result, sadly, none of them succeeded. Slaanesh deployed every possible temptation. In the end, it was Slaanesh who reached the ultimate climax because of Chuck Norris. In the crystalline spires of Craftworld Ulthwé, where the delicate balance between survival and extinction was maintained through constant vigilance, Farseer Eldrad Ulthrin meditated before the dome of crystal Seers. For thousands of years he had peered into the skein of fate, guiding his people through the treacherous currents of possibility that threatened to dash their dying race upon the rocks of extinction. The Eldar were a species haunted by their own success. Once they had ruled a galactic empire that spanned millions of worlds, their psychic abilities and technological mastery making them the undisputed masters of the galaxy. But their very perfection had been their downfall, their pursuit of ultimate experience and sensation, giving birth to Slaanesh, the chaos god that had consumed their empire and devoured the souls of billions. Now they clung to existence on vast ships that sailed through the void, their numbers so reduced that every death was a tragedy, every birth a precious gift. The Seers used their gifts to see the threads of future possibility, making the careful choices that would allow their race to continue for another day, another year, another millennium. Eldrad's consciousness flowed through the currents of the warp, following the probability lines that stretched like glowing threads through the darkness. He had foreseen the rise of chaos, the coming of the great Devourer, the return of the ancient Necron dynasties. His visions had saved countless Eldar lives, allowing them to avoid catastrophes before they occurred. But on this day, as he turned his sight toward the anomaly that had appeared in the Terran system, Eldrad encountered something that defied every principle of prognostication he had mastered over millennia of practice. Chuck Norris stood at the center of every future timeline, but rather than being affected by the flowing currents of possibility, he seemed to be the point around which all potential futures revolved. The Farseer attempted to trace the threads of causality that connected this being to the various outcomes he observed, but each attempt resulted in the same incomprehensible conclusion. Chuck Norris was not subject to fate. Fate was subject to Chuck Norris. Eldrad pressed deeper into his vision, drawing upon psychic abilities that had been honed across centuries of training. He reached out with senses that could perceive the thoughts of beings light years away, that could touch the minds of the dead and the unborn. He focused every fragment of his considerable power on understanding this entity that had begun reshaping the galaxy's destiny. The moment his psychic consciousness made contact with Chuck Norris's presence, something unprecedented occurred. Eldrad's third eye, the psychic organ that allowed him to perceive the hidden dimensions of reality, simply stopped functioning. Not damaged or destroyed, but politely informed that it was attempting to observe something beyond its operational parameters. The Farseer's physical eyes opened in his meditation chamber, but where once they had glowed with the inner fire of psychic sight, now there was only ordinary vision. Eldrad Ulthron, greatest of the craft world seers, had been rendered as blind to the future as any mundane human. Across Ulthwé, similar fates befell every warlock, every seer, every Eldar who possessed even the slightest gift of foresight. The crystalline matrices that focused their psychic abilities went dark. The runestones that helped them interpret the skein of fate became simple carved rocks. In attempting to comprehend Chuck Norris, they had encountered something that existed so far outside their understanding that their gifts had simply acknowledged their inadequacy and retired. In the webway city of Kamara, where pain was currency and suffering was art, Archon Vecht presided over the most sophisticated torture chambers in the galaxy. The Dark Eldar had found their own solution to the problem of Slaanesh. By inflicting pain and anguish on others, they could stave off the hunger of she who thirsts, feeding the chaos god, the suffering of their victims instead of their own souls. The Dark City was a testament to the refinement of cruelty. Every building was designed to maximize the acoustic properties of screams. Every street was arranged to provide the best viewing angles for public torments. The Homunculi master surgeons of agony had perfected techniques that could keep subjects conscious and aware through procedures that redefined the boundaries of physical endurance. Lady Malleus, supreme overlord of the Cabal of the Poisoned Tongue, had recently acquired a most unusual prize. Reports from her scouts spoke of a being who had appeared in real space without protection, walking through vacuum as if it were a pleasant garden. Such an entity would provide entertainment unlike any other, the joy of breaking something that appeared unbreakable. The capture had been embarrassingly simple. Chuck Norris had offered no resistance when her warriors surrounded him, had shown no fear when presented with the implements of torment that had broken the spirits of Space Marine captains and Imperial saints. He had simply looked around the torture chamber with the mild interest of a tourist examining local architecture. Malleus personally supervised the initial procedures, applying techniques that had been perfected over millennia of practice. Neural flensing that should have caused madness within seconds, bone boring that had reduced demon princes to weeping husks, psychic tortures that had broken the minds of powerful psychers. Chuck Norris remained completely unaffected occasionally, nodding as if appreciating the craftsmanship involved in the torture devices. For 13 days, the most skilled homunculi in Camera applied their arts. They used pain amplifiers that multiplied nerve signals by factors of millions. They employed agony engines that fed directly on suffering devices that could extract screams from the dead. They brought forth the ancient tools that had been used to torture the old ones themselves during the war in heaven. Not once did Chuck Norris show any sign of discomfort. On the 14th day, something unprecedented occurred in the history of the Dark City. The torturers, those masters of inflicting suffering who had refined cruelty into a high art, began to experience the pain themselves, not through any reflection or psychic backlash, but as if the universe had decided that someone should be suffering during these sessions, and since it wasn't going to be Chuck Norris, it would have to be them. The sensation was unlike anything the Dark Elder had experienced. They were accustomed to being the ones who controlled pain, who dispensed it with surgical precision and artistic flair. To find themselves on the receiving end of their own expertise was a humiliation beyond their ability to process. Lady Malleus herself, who had overseen the torture of Primarchs and the flensing of living saints, found herself curled in the corner of her own torture chamber, overwhelmed by sensations that her enhanced nervous system interpreted as the accumulated suffering of every victim she had ever claimed. Within hours, the proud archons of Camorra were begging for the mercy they had never shown their own victims. The homunculi masters of surgical precision turned their tools upon themselves in a desperate attempt to end suffering they could not comprehend. The Dark City, which had echoed with the screams of countless victims for millennia, now rang with the anguish of its rulers. By the end of the 13th day, the surviving Dark Eldar had made a collective decision that would have been impossible to imagine moments before. Rather than continue to exist in a universe where their fundamental nature had been so thoroughly invalidated, they chose self-destruction, each one finding their own method of ending an existence that had become unbearable. Chuck Norris walked out of Camera as casually as he had entered, leaving behind a city of the dead, who had discovered that there were indeed limits to what suffering could be endured. In the deepest recesses of the Dark City, even she who thirsts, Slaanesh herself, felt a moment of confusion as one of her most reliable sources of sustenance simply vanished overnight, the torturer's souls she had fed upon for millennia choosing oblivion over continued existence. The records of these events would be sealed in the most protected archives of both the craft worlds and the Inquisition. The Eldar Farseers gazed into Chuck Norris's future. Result: permanent blindness. Dark Eldar tortured Chuck Norris. After 13 days of excruciating pain, they destroyed themselves. On the sept world of Tau, where the gleaming spires of progress pierced a sky unmarred by pollution or conflict, Anva, the oldest and most revered of the ethereal caste, stood before the assembled representatives of the Tau Empire. Though imperial records claimed he had perished in previous conflicts, his presence here was evidence of another impossibility. When Chuck Norris walks among the stars, even death becomes negotiable. The Great Council Chamber, its walls adorned with holographic displays showing the expansion of Tau influence across dozens of worlds, hummed with the quiet efficiency that characterized all aspects of Tau society. The Tau Empire was young by galactic standards, a mere 6,000 years old, but in that brief span, they had achieved something that had eluded most species for millennia: true unity of purpose. Where other civilizations were torn apart by factional conflict, religious schism, or simple greed, the Tau had found harmony through the philosophy of the Tauva, the greater good. The greater good was more than mere political ideology. It was the fundamental organizing principle that guided every aspect of Tau civilization. Each individual, regardless of caste or station, existed to serve the collective benefit of their species. Personal ambition was subordinated to communal advancement. Individual desires were balanced against the needs of the whole. It was a philosophy that had transformed a collection of primitive tribes into a spacefaring empire in a fraction of the time such evolution typically required. Anva, his ancient form, supported by sophisticated life extension technology, raised one withered hand for silence. At 300 years old, he was practically immortal by the standards of Mosto, his wisdom accumulated through centuries of guiding his people toward their manifest destiny among the stars. My fellow servants of the greater good. He began, his voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustic enhancement systems. We gather today to address reports from our forward scout fleets. Our Firecast warriors have encountered an anomaly in the Mongu systems, a being whose existence challenges our understanding of the cosmic order. Commander Shadowsun, the most celebrated military leader in the Empire's history, accessed the tactical displays from her position among the Firecast representatives. The data streams showed impossible readings. Energy signatures that defied classification, gravitational disturbances that suggested technologies beyond even the TO's advanced understanding. Honored ethereal, she said, her voice respectful but tinged with the practical concerns of a veteran warrior. Our scouts report that this entity appears to be unaugmented baseline human. Yet our instruments record phenomena that exceed the capabilities of even the most advanced battlesuit technology. Anva nodded slowly, his ancient eyes reflecting decades of accumulated wisdom. Indeed, Commander. Which brings us to the central question. How does such a being fit within the framework of the greater good? If there exist entities of such power, what role should they play in the cosmic order we seek to establish? The question hung in the air of the council chamber like incense from a sacred ceremony. For 6 millennia, the TO had expanded their influence through a combination of military conquest and diplomatic integration, offering other species the opportunity to join their empire and contribute to the greater good, according to their abilities. Humans served as auxiliary troops and administrators. Kroot provided reconnaissance and close combat expertise. Vespid offered aerial superiority and mineral extraction capabilities. But what role could be offered to a being who appeared to transcend the very concepts of cooperation and hierarchy that made the greater good possible? As the assembled representatives debated this philosophical challenge, something extraordinary began to occur throughout the chamber. The holographic displays that showed the TO characters for Tauva, the greater good, began to flicker and change. Not through any technical malfunction or external interference, but as if the characters themselves were being politely corrected by an authority higher than the Empire's most advanced AI systems, where once the ancient Tau script had read Tauva, now it displayed Chukva. The change spread throughout the chamber, then throughout the CT world, then throughout the entire TO Empire, with a speed that exceeded even their most advanced communication networks. Every data slate, every holographic display, every piece of technology that had ever displayed the sacred phrase, "for the greater good," now read, "for Chuck's good." Commander Shadowsun stared at her tactical display in confusion. Her enhanced neural interfaces, designed to process battlefield information at superhuman speeds, struggled to comprehend what her sensors were reporting. The fundamental organizing principle of her civilization had just been updated. Anva felt something he had never experienced in 3 centuries of life: philosophical uncertainty. The greater good had been the bedrock of Tau existence, the unchanging truth around which their entire society was organized. To see it altered even in name challenged his understanding of cosmic order itself. But as the elderly ethereal contemplated this change, he found that it felt right. Not imposed or artificial, but like a correction that had been needed for some time. The Empire's expansion, their integration of other species, their vision of a galaxy united in common purpose, all of these goals remained unchanged. Only the name had been updated to reflect a more accurate understanding of the universe's true hierarchy. Perhaps, Anva said slowly, his voice carrying a note of wonder that surprised even himself, we have been working toward Chuck's good all along without realizing it. The other ethereals in the chamber nodded in solemn agreement. Watercast diplomats began drafting new treaties that referenced the updated philosophy. Earthcast engineers modified their construction protocols to reflect the new paradigm. Aircast pilots updated their navigation systems to acknowledge the cosmic truth that had been revealed to them. Throughout the Tau Empire, the transition was remarkably smooth. Citizens who had dedicated their lives to serving the greater good found that their devotion transferred seamlessly to Chuck's good. The fundamental principle remained the same, the subordination of individual desire to collective benefit, but now with the understanding that this collective benefit was part of a larger cosmic plan centered around an entity whose power transcended anything they had previously imagined. Within days, Tau expeditionary fleets were spreading the message to other species within their sphere of influence. Humans who had joined the Empire were informed that their service to the greater good had been redesignated as service to Chuck's good. Kroot hunting packs received updated mission parameters. Vespid colonies adjusted their mining quotas to better serve the revised philosophy. The transformation was so complete and so natural that within a single rotation of Tau, it was as if Chuck's good had always been the organizing principle of their civilization. History texts were updated, philosophical treatises were revised, and military doctrines were modified to reflect the new understanding. Commander Shadowsun, reviewing the strategic implications of this revelation, found herself oddly comforted by the change. The Tau Empire's mission remained the same, to bring order and progress to a chaotic galaxy, but now they served a cause that transcended even their own ambitious vision of the future. The truth would be recorded in the Empire's most classified archives, accessible only to the highest-ranking ethereals. The ethereals preached greater good. When Chuck Norris arrived, it was renamed Chuck's Good. In the fortress monastery of Titan, hidden within the warp storms that shrouded Saturn's largest moon, the Grey Knights maintained their eternal vigil against the forces of chaos. For 10,000 years, they had served as humanity's ultimate weapon against demonic incursion warriors whose very existence was classified at the highest levels of imperial authority. Supreme Grand Master Kaldor Drygo stood in the Chamber of Purity, surrounded by the most sacred relics of his chapter. The Blade of Antweer, forged from psychically active metals and blessed by the Emperor himself. The Aegis armor, each piece inscribed with hexagrammic wards that could turn aside the claws of greater demons. The Nemesis weapons, force weapons capable of banishing demons back to the warp with a single strike. The Grey Knights were perhaps the most elite fighting force in the galaxy. Each battle brother was not only a space marine enhanced beyond normal human limits, but also a potent psyker trained from childhood in the arts of demonic banishment. They carried the Emperor's own gene seed, making them uniquely resistant to the corrupting influence of chaos. In 10 millennia of service, not a single Grey Knight had ever fallen to corruption, a record unmatched by any other force in the Imperium. Their fortress monastery was a marvel of defensive engineering, existing partially within the warp itself to allow rapid deployment to demonic incursions anywhere in the galaxy. The Grand Libraries contained the most complete collection of demonic lore in human space, cataloging the true names, weaknesses, and banishment rituals for thousands of warp entities. Every weapon, every armor plate, every bolt round used by the Grey Knights was specifically consecrated for the destruction of creatures that existed beyond the normal laws of physics. But on this day, as reports filtered in from across the galaxy, Supreme Grand Master Drygo found himself confronting a crisis unlike any his chapter had faced in their long history. Brother Captain Stern approached through the chamber's massive adamantium doors, his Terminator armor bearing the scars of countless battles against the forces of chaos. His force, halberd weapon that had personally banished 3 greater demons, hummed with barely contained psychic energy. "Supreme Grand Master," Stern reported, his voice carrying undertones of confusion that would have been unthinkable in any other circumstance. The monitoring stations report complete cessation of demonic activity across 17 sectors. No warp rifts, no possession incidents, no greater demon manifestations. Drago's enhanced intellect processed this information with growing concern. In the 10,000 years since the Grey Knight's founding, demonic activity had never ceased entirely. Even during the rare periods of relative peace, isolated incidents of possession or minor warp rifts required constant vigilance. For 17 entire sectors to report 0 demonic activity was unprecedented. Casualties. Drago asked, his mind already calculating the resources that would be required for such a massive cleansing operation. None, my lord. No battles were fought. No banishment rituals were performed. The demons simply are not there. Brother Captain Stern's report was followed by similar communications from Grey Knight strike forces across the galaxy. Squad Purifier Thane reported that the greater demon he had been tracking for 3 months had simply vanished mid-manifestation, leaving behind only the faint scent of ozone. Brother Librarian Hyperion's psychic senses, finely tuned to detect even the slightest warp disturbance, registered nothing but empty void where once demonic presences had writhed. The implications were staggering. If demons were no longer manifesting in real space, if the forces of chaos had withdrawn their primary agents of corruption, then what purpose did the Grey Knights serve? Grandmaster Vorth Mordrak, veteran of campaigns that spanned centuries, entered the Chamber of Purity with news that confirmed Drago's growing suspicions. My Lord Inquisitor Torquemada reports similar phenomena from the Ordo Malleus. Demonic cults across 3 subsectors have simply disbanded. Their leaders claim the entities they served have gone away and refuse to elaborate further. Drago activated the chamber's primary communication array, linking him to Grey Knight's forces throughout the galaxy. For the first time in the chapter's history, he prepared to issue an order that challenged their fundamental purpose. All Grey Knight's forces. This is Supreme Grandmaster Drago. Suspend active operations pending further evaluation. Return to nearest chapter facility for debriefing and reassignment. The silence that followed his transmission was profound. Across dozens of star systems, Grey Knights who had spent their entire lives preparing for war against demons found themselves with no enemy to fight. Strike forces that had been en route to banish greater demons discovered their targets had simply ceased to exist. Purifier squads trained in the most esoteric banishment rituals sat in their transport craft, their specialized knowledge suddenly rendered obsolete. In the days that followed, investigations revealed the scope of the phenomenon. Every demon prince had retreated to the deepest levels of the warp. Lesser demons had simply dissolved back into raw warp energy rather than risk manifestation in real space. Even the most minor warp sprites, creatures barely conscious enough to qualify as demons, had fled to dimensions so removed from reality that detecting them was impossible. The cause of this universal retreat became clear when intercepted chaos communications revealed a single repeated phrase: Chuck Norris walks among the stars. The name meant nothing to Imperial databases, but its effect on the forces of chaos was undeniable. Whatever this Chuck Norris represented, its mere presence in the galaxy had caused every demon in existence to abandon their eternal war against reality. Supreme Grand Master Drago found himself in the unprecedented position of commanding the most elite anti-demon force in the galaxy at a time when demons had effectively ceased to exist. 10,000 years of training, tradition, and purpose had been rendered meaningless by the arrival of a single entity whose very existence negated the need for their service. In the chapter's most secure archives, scribes recorded what would become the shortest mission report in Grey Knight's history. The truth was classified at levels that exceeded even Inquisitor Lord Clearance. Grey Knights were created to fight demons. But demons vanished just from fear of Chuck Norris. The Grey Knights became unemployed. In the deepest archives of the Eldar craft worlds, where knowledge older than human civilization was preserved in wraithbone matrices and crystalline data cores, there existed records of the Old Ones. These beings were spoken of in whispers, even among the ancient Eldar who had witnessed the birth and death of stars. They were the first, the shapers, the architects of life itself, who had walked between the stars when the galaxy was young and malleable. The Old Ones had been gods in the truest sense, not the crude emotional entities that the younger races worshipped, but beings of such advanced understanding that they could reshape reality through will alone. They had created the webway, that network of tunnels through space and time that allowed instantaneous travel across galactic distances. They had seeded countless worlds with life-guiding evolution and consciousness along paths that served their incomprehensible purposes. Most significantly, they had created the younger races as weapons in their war against the Citan and their Necron servants. The Eldar had been shaped as warriors of psychic might, their souls burning bright in the warp, to serve as living weapons against the soul-consuming star gods. The orcs had been designed as an endless tide of brutality creatures who could reproduce rapidly and fight without fear or complex motivation. Even humanity, according to some theories, bore the subtle marks of Old One genetic manipulation. But the Old Ones had vanished during the War in Heaven, that cosmic conflict that had raged across the galaxy 65 million years ago. Some said they had ascended to higher dimensions. Others believed they had been destroyed by the Seton or consumed by the psychic backlash of their own creations. The truth had been lost to time, leaving only fragments of their technology and the civilizations they had shaped. In the crystalline halls of Craftworld, Alatak, where the most learned bone singers preserved the oldest songs of creation, Farseer Ayana Arianal contemplated mysteries that predated her species' existence. The recent events in the galaxy had triggered resonances in the ancient lore that suggested connections she had never before considered. The entity known as Chuck Norris had appeared at a moment when the fundamental forces of the galaxy were shifting. The Chaos Gods had retreated, the Seton had fallen silent, and even the Tyrannid hive fleets had fled to the galactic rim. Such a convergence of impossible events suggested the intervention of a power that transcended the current cosmic order. As Iana accessed the deepest memory cores, sorting through millions of years of accumulated knowledge, she discovered references that had been dismissed as mythology or mistranslation. Fragments of Old One records that spoke not of their own origins but of their creator, a being whose existence had been so fundamental to reality that acknowledging it directly was considered dangerous. The records were fragmentary, encoded in languages that predated the development of conscious thought, but the message they contained was clear. The Old Ones had not been the first intelligence in the galaxy. They had been created, shaped, and given purpose by something that existed on a level so far above their own advanced understanding that they could barely comprehend it. The Creator was described in terms that seemed to reference physical exercise and martial prowess, concepts that made no sense when applied to beings of cosmic significance. Yet the consistency of the references across multiple sources suggested that these descriptions were not metaphorical, but literal. The entity that had shaped the Old Ones was associated with activities that the records translated as the sacred push-ups and the eternal kicking. More disturbing were the fragments that suggested the Old Ones had lived in constant fear of obsolescence. They had been version 1.0 of their creator's design, and they knew it. The possibility that their maker might decide to develop an improved model, the theoretical Old Twos, had haunted them throughout their existence. According to the most ancient records, the Old Ones had actually encountered their creator during the height of their civilization. The meeting had taken place in a location described as the place where physics go to rest, and had lasted for what the Old Ones measured as 17 moments of pure understanding. During this encounter, the Old Ones had reportedly prostrated themselves before their maker and begged for a promise that would ensure their continued relevance. They pleaded that their creator would never develop the Old Twos, the hypothetical upgrade that would render their entire species as obsolete as they had rendered the purely biological life forms they had superseded. The creator had apparently found their request amusing, but had agreed to their terms. The Old Ones would remain the only version of their particular design template, free to pursue their cosmic projects without fear of replacement by a superior model. This promise had given the Old Ones the confidence to reshape the galaxy according to their vision to wage war against the Setan and to create the younger races as their servants and weapons. But it had also bound them to a state of perpetual anxiety. They were protected from replacement, but they knew that protection existed only because their creator chose to honor an ancient agreement. The war in heaven had ended not with the destruction of the Old Ones, but with their voluntary withdrawal from active participation in galactic affairs. They had not died or ascended to higher dimensions. They had simply chosen to step back, becoming observers, rather than actors, maintaining the lowest possible profile to avoid drawing their creator's attention. Farseer Ayana felt her enhanced consciousness reel as she processed the implications of this revelation. Every major event in galactic history, the rise and fall of the Eldar Empire, the birth of Slanesh, the Horus Heresy, the coming of the Tyrannids, had unfolded under the distant observation of beings who themselves served at the pleasure of an entity whose casual exercise routine could reshape solar systems. And now that entity had returned to active involvement in galactic affairs, walking among the stars as he had in the ancient days when the old ones had begged for their continued existence. In the most restricted archives of the craft world, where knowledge too dangerous for general consumption was stored, the truth was recorded for future generations of Eldar scholars. The old ones were once considered the creators of the universe. Truth. Chuck Norris created the old ones, and they begged him never to create the upgraded old twos. The transformation of the galaxy had been neither swift nor violent. Chuck Norris had simply walked, and with each step the fundamental nature of existence had quietly rearranged itself to accommodate his presence. What had taken 40 millennia of warfare, suffering, and endless conflict to establish was undone not through conquest or revolution, but through the simple act of one man taking a casual stroll through the cosmos. On Terra, the Golden Throne stood empty for the first time in 10,000 years. The Emperor, freed from his eternal vigil, walked the halls of his palace with steps that no longer carried the weight of humanity's survival. The daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers had ceased, not because the Astronomicon had failed, but because it no longer required such fuel to burn with perfect clarity across the galaxy. High Lord Commander Militant Cornelius Sola reviewed reports that would have been dismissed as fever dreams mere months earlier. Chaos incursions had dropped to 0 across all the 17 segmentums. WAAAGH had transformed into philosophical discussion groups focused on proper exercise technique. Tyranid hive fleets had retreated beyond the galactic rim, apparently suffering from collective indigestion on a cosmic scale. The Imperium's vast military apparatus, designed to wage eternal war against enemies that sought nothing less than humanity's extinction, found itself without purpose. Guard regiments trained for battles that would never come. Space Marine chapters filed reports detailing successful pacification campaigns that had required no actual fighting. The Inquisition's archives filled with testimonies of heretics who had spontaneously converted to the Imperial Creed after experiencing what they described as a profound sense that resistance was pointless. In the Eye of Terror, where reality had been twisted into impossible shapes by 10,000 years of chaos worship, the warp storms that had raged since the Horus heresy simply dissipated. Demon worlds found their inhabitants departing for other dimensions not in defeat, but with what observers could only describe as embarrassment. The Chaos Space Marines, who had pledged their souls to eternal war, discovered that their patron gods had developed sudden interests in peaceful pursuits. Khorne's brass citadel had been transformed into a meditation garden where former berserkers practiced breathing exercises. Nurgle's plague gardens had become centers for holistic wellness, their diseased blooms replaced by flowers that promoted rather than consumed life. Tzeentch's impossible labyrinths had been simplified into straightforward walking paths with clearly marked signs. Slaanesha's Palace of Excess had been converted into a rehabilitation center, where former hedonists learned the virtue of moderation. The webway, that ancient network of tunnels through space and time created by the old ones, had begun spontaneously expanding and improving itself. New passages opened that led not to strategic locations or resource-rich worlds, but to scenic overlooks and peaceful rest stops suitable for contemplation. The Dark Eldar of WAAAGH, those few who had survived their encounter with their own torture devices, emerged to find their city transformed into a quiet suburb with excellent public transportation and community centers offering anger management classes. On Craftworld, Ulthwé Farseer, Eldrad Ulthron sat in his meditation chamber, no longer attempting to peer into the future, but simply enjoying the novel experience of not knowing what would happen next. His blindness to fate had become a gift rather than a curse. For the first time in millennia, the Eldar could live in the present rather than constantly calculating the probability threads of survival. The Tau Empire had achieved their dream of galactic unity, though not through the expansion they had envisioned. Instead of bringing other species into the embrace of the greater good, they discovered that Chuck's good had a radius of effect that encompassed the entire galaxy. Their technological advancement continued, but now focused on developing better exercise equipment and improved philosophical treatises on the nature of cosmic harmony. In the tomb worlds of the Necrons, the Silent King Sarek found himself in the unprecedented position of ruling a people who had rediscovered contentment. The ancient hunger for biological form had been replaced by satisfaction with their role as cosmic fitness equipment. The star maps in their tomb complexes no longer tracked conquest targets, but instead marked optimal locations for contemplative stargazing. The Tyranid hive fleets, those unstoppable swarms of biological perfection, had retreated to the space between galaxies where they engaged in what xenobiologists could only classify as species-wide therapy sessions. The trauma of their encounter with Chuck Norris had fundamentally altered their approach to consumption, replacing their drive to devour with an interest in sustainable ecological practices. But perhaps the most profound change was in humanity itself. The grim darkness of the far future, that oppressive atmosphere of constant war and inevitable doom that had defined human existence for 40 millennia, had simply evaporated. Children born in the aftermath of Chuck Norris's walk grew up in a galaxy where peace was not a distant dream, but a present reality. The Imperial Guard found themselves retrained as peacekeeping forces and infrastructure maintenance crews. Space Marines discovered that their enhanced physiology was perfectly suited for rescue operations and community service projects. The Adeptus Mechanicus redirected their research toward improving quality of life, rather than developing increasingly efficient weapons of war. Yet as the galaxy settled into this new golden age, a troubling realization began to emerge among those who recorded and preserved history. The scribes of the Administratum, the chroniclers of the Space Marine chapters, the memory cores of the Eldar craft worlds all reached the same inevitable conclusion. The Warhammer 40,000 universe had been defined by its darkness. The endless war, the cosmic horror, the grim struggle for survival against impossible odds. These elements had not been obstacles to overcome, but the very essence of what made this reality unique. In solving every problem, in bringing peace to every conflict, in transforming every enemy into a friend, Chuck Norris had achieved something that no force in 40 millennia had managed. He had ended Warhammer 40,000. The galaxy was now peaceful, prosperous, and unified. Humanity had found its place among the stars not through conquest, but through the recognition that competition was unnecessary when viewed from a cosmic perspective. The various species worked together on projects of mutual benefit, sharing knowledge and resources with a cooperation that would have been impossible under the old paradigm of eternal war. But in creating this paradise, something essential had been lost. The stories that had defined this universe, tales of heroic sacrifice against overwhelming odds of small victories, wrested from the jaws of cosmic defeat of hope maintained in the face of certain doom, no longer had any meaning. There were no overwhelming odds to face no cosmic defeat to forestall no doom to resist. The paradox was complete and inescapable. Chuck Norris, through the simple act of being himself, had saved the Warhammer 40,000 universe by destroying everything that made it Warhammer 40,000. And in a final twist that would echo through Dimension's unknown games, Workshop found itself facing bankruptcy. For how could they continue to sell a grim, dark setting where everyone was happy, peaceful, and united in Chuck's good? In the deepest archives of Terra, where the most fundamental truths of existence were preserved for future generations, the final entry was made in the Chronicle of Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris walked around the galaxy. Chaos collapsed. Xenos converted Imperium, found peace. Result: Warhammer 40k was no longer Warhammer 40k.